Order. We have 6 judicial nominees on the agenda today who will be held over at the request of the minority. They are Cindy Chung for the 3rd Circuit, Justice Tamika Montgomery Reeves for the 3rd Circuit, 4 nominees for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, Kelly Hodge, John Murphy, Judge Mia Perez, and Judge Kai Scott. I look forward to voting on these nominees next week. We have 2 U.S. Marshal nominees on the agenda, which I hope can receive an en bloc voice vote. Before turning to Ranking Member Grassley, let me briefly discuss the violence and threats of violence facing the FBI since it executed the lawful search warrant at the former president's residence on August the 8th. Earlier this week, I introduced and the Senate unanimously passed a resolution condemning this violence and the rhetoric that fuels it. It was the right thing to do. I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle for supporting this resolution. Following the August 8th research, the former president and his allies have relentlessly criticized the FBI with baseless claims and violent rhetoric, including calls to, quote, destroy the FBI, shoot the FBI, and actual reference to the FBI by the former president as, quote, vicious monsters, close quote. Attacking the FBI is not new, but the breadth of the anti-FBI vitriol from public officials has contributed, as we know, to a stunning increase in violence against the FBI, violent threats against the FBI. We heard about these threats, excuse me, Amy? Excuse me? Excuse me. We heard about these threats during a closed-door briefing last week that members on both sides of the committee attended. I am encouraged with the passage of this resolution, and I'm glad the Senate spoke with one voice in condemning violence on the right and on the left against law enforcement. In doing so, we specifically urged public officials at every level to reject and condemn political violence and its threat, regardless of its motivation. We condemn calls from members of Congress to destroy the FBI and defund the FBI. We honored the dedicated services of the employees of that agency, and we reaffirm that, quote, a founding principle of the United States is that individuals settle differences through political process, not through the use or threat of violence. Now I'll recognize Ranking Member Grassley for any remarks.
I think I said last week or recently when you spoke on the same subject that I applaud you for saying what you were saying. And for anybody, including Chuck Grassley, I've never said defund the police, but you can't defund the police and be against that and be for defunding the FBI. So I hope you know I completely agree with you. And I also like to say, though, when I criticize the FBI, I always try to make it clear that I think the problems are at central FBI headquarters and not with the rank and file that work the grassroots of Iowa, dozens and dozens of people that are doing their job. I want to follow up on a matter that I raised a few weeks ago. It saddens me to see news reports that the House Democrats are rejecting the police bills that passed the Senate with unanimous consent. These are very good bills, one of them fighting PTSD, which I led with Senator Cruz, supported mental health treatment for law enforcement officers and firefighters with PTSD. Officers face dangerous situations on a regular basis that leaves them suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and this bill would have helped support them. The Law Enforcement De-Escalation Training Act was designed to help train officers to de-escalate dangerous situations and avoid violence. The Strong Communities Act was designed to recruit and retain officers who would live in their home communities. As for the Invest to Protect bill, we did the courtesy of passing the House version of their Police Week bills. The House should pass the Senate versions of Invest to Protect as well. I repeat, all of these bills unanimously passed out of the Senate, meaning no Republican or Democrat senator objected to these bills in the Senate. We worked hard for months on getting everything across the finish line, including working with Senator Booker, who voiced some concerns in our markup. but the House Democrats decided instead to offer up a bunch of bills that they know will be dead on arrival in the Senate. I want to thank Senator Durbin, our chairman, for reaching out to the House to try to move these bills forward, but unfortunately they have chosen not to listen. I know many House Democrats who worked on these bills must be disappointed, as I am, but it is clear that certain extreme elements in the House Democrat caucus can't have a normal police week where we pass each other's bills, and they were able to exert pressure to stand in the way of this legislation. I ask the House to reconsider this pass. Police and firefighters need our support. I'd also like to mention the Hunter Biden special counsel letter that Republican members sent to Attorney General Garland this week. The letter requests that special counsel protections and authorities be extended to U.S. Attorney Weiss. Senator Cornyn led the charge in getting that letter done. I thank him very much for his leadership in doing that. On May 9th of this year, Senator Johnson and I wrote to U.S. Attorney Weiss. We asked him whether he acquired relevant records to fully advance the Hunter Biden investigation. We asked him if he receives sufficient resources and support from the Justice Department to execute the investigation. We also asked him if he discussed the need for a special counsel to properly investigate Hunter Biden criminal matter. Attorney General Garland interceded and answered on Weiss's behalf, although calling it an answer doesn't do the letter any justice whatsoever. It was another letter with just words on a piece of paper. Moreover, it showed that maybe U.S. Attorney Weiss isn't as independent as he should be if the Justice Department proper answers on his behalf. Now, there's another reason why I joined Senator Cornyn's letter. Whistleblowers have presented allegations to me that the FBI had ongoing investigative activity into Hunter Biden in advance of the 2020 election. The whistleblowers' disclosure to me relate to investigative activity and avenue of information that originated separate from the ongoing Hunter Biden criminal probe, and it's related to potentially criminal conduct. Special Agent Thibault and others at the FBI shut down the activity right before the 2020 election. So I asked Director Wray the following, quote, from our letter: when the FBI receives potential criminal information related to a matter that's the subject to investigation and prosecution by a U.S. attorney, is it the FBI's standard practice to share that information with relevant U.S. attorney offices, end of quote. Director Wray said it was his experience that the information would be shared. Well, how can then that information be shared if it's shut down? The Justice Department, the FBI, have failed to answer that very critical question. Therefore, as I've said publicly before, there's a very real concern that the ongoing criminal matter investigation didn't include the full scope of facts and evidence. The Justice Department, the FBI's failure to be transparent with Congress and the American people has cast a cloud over the Hunter Biden investigation. Simply put, how can the people, American people, trust the results if the investigation doesn't include at least all of the known information? I yield.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Before we turn to the bill S673, I understand we can take an unblocked voice vote on 2 U.S. Marshal nominees: Thomas Brown to be U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Georgia, Kirk Taylor to be U.S. Marshal for the District of Colorado. Does anyone wish to speak on the nominees?
Mr. Chairman?
I'm sorry.
Down here, way down the end.
Senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am grateful to you and the ranking member for today bringing up Thomas Brown, the former DeKalb County Sheriff and a distinguished leader and law enforcement officer in the state of Georgia, who is the President's nominee for U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Georgia. This is a highly qualified individual with a strong track record on public safety, and Senator Reverend Warnock and I both support his confirmation. I respectfully hope that we can achieve bipartisan or unanimous support today and get this important post filled in Georgia. Thank you.
If no one else speaks recognition, unfavorably reporting the nomination of Thomas Brown and Kirk Taylor to be U.S. Marshals, those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The majority of members present having voted in the affirmative, the ayes have it. Are there any members wishing to be recorded as no?
I have a request from Senator Hawley, no on both Brown and Taylor.
Any others?
No, that's it.
And Senator Blackburn, no on both? On both nominees? Okay. Anyone else? Those votes will be noted in the record. The nomination is favorably reported to the nominations favorably reported to the floor. And now we'll turn to S673. Journalism Competition Preservation Act, sponsored by Senators Klobuchar and Kennedy, co-sponsored by other members of the committee, Booker, Whitehouse, Feinstein, Graham, Hirono, Blumenthal, and myself. I think we all know the substance of this bill. I won't repeat it. Today, or 2 weeks ago, we held the bill over after the adoption of an amendment by the senator from Texas, Senator Cruz. That decision was not made due to the topic of the amendment, namely concerns about censorship, but rather because of a problem of unintended consequences of the amendment, as I understood it. The amendment offered by the senator from Texas would create a loophole in the JCPA that would allow giant online platforms like Google and Facebook to opt out of joint negotiations with news organizations. I'm going to, at this point, defer to the sponsor of the bill to explain what has happened since that amendment has been adopted.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I first just want to thank all the co-sponsors of the bill, Senator Feinstein. I want to thank you for your co-sponsorship of this bill and your strong remarks last 2 weeks ago. I want to thank you, Senator Durbin, for guiding us through, and Senator Graham, Senator Whitehouse, Blumenthal, Hirono, Booker, as well as several others, Senator Grassley, thank you, who have assisted with this bill. As I said before, we are at great risk of losing our news reporting, because while U.S. newspapers' ad revenue plummeted $37 billion in 2008 to less than $9 billion in 2020, Google and Meta, also known as Facebook, became digital advertising titans, raking in billions in ad dollars while taking news content. So what we're doing here is really, really important, and I have so appreciated the last week. I have worked with Senator Kennedy, our lead Republican author, as well as Senator Cruz, to get at some of the concerns raised. And what's interesting about this, as this bill has been bipartisan from the beginning, Mr. Chair, we actually share the view that this is not about content, that this is simply about negotiating prices. And the platforms discussing and agreeing on issues. This was never the intent of the legislation to get at content. The goal of the bill is to allow local news organizations to get compensation when major titans, monopolies like Facebook and Google access their content. And it wasn't about facilitating negotiations about content. For reasons we discussed 2 weeks ago, I opposed Senator Cruz's initial amendment, and we held the bill over, as we should do, to allow the parties to negotiate. I also spoke with Senator Padilla about some of his concerns, and we included one of his amendments as well as several other changes that he had as we went into the negotiations. For the last 2 weeks, Senator Cruz, Kennedy, and I have been working on an amendment that would allow this bill to proceed. This amendment is the product of those negotiations, Amendment SIL 22B36. It replaces Senator Cruz's amendment with provisions that further clarify that the bill's focus is solely on compensation for news organizations when platforms access their content, and that discussions or agreements between news organizations and platforms on content are outside of the scope of the bill and outside of the scope of the narrow antitrust safe harbor under the bill. And the amendment accomplishes this goal without giving these tech companies a tool to avoid their obligations under the bill by disrupting their joint negotiations or arbitration that will get news organizations finally paid for their content. We agreed that this amendment addresses Senator Cruz's concerns in a content-neutral way in keeping with the original intent of the bill. Platforms like Facebook and Google are counting on Republicans and Democrats being unable to put aside their differences to agree on meaningful legislation in the tech center. This is our moment to prove them wrong. This amendment, the product of bipartisan negotiation, shows that we can work together to find common ground on these issues. I thank Senator Kennedy. I thank Senator Cruz for working with me in good faith to craft this amendment. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the amendment.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Let me now recognize the Republican co-sponsor, Senator Kennedy, if he'd like to make remarks relating to this amendment.
I don't have any remarks, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to hear Senator Cruz's amendment.
I believe that Senator Klobuchar has offered the amendment. Am I correct, Senator?
Yes, I have.
Well, then I'd like to hear Senator Cruz explain it.
And Mr. Chairman,
Senator Cruz, Senator Padilla.
after Senator Cruz.
Senator Cruz, do you seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Kennedy, let me commend the authors of this bill for the hard work they put in on an important issue. I agree that big tech exercises a concentration of power that I think is unknown in the history of mankind. And that concentration of power is regularly used to trample on the little guy, to trample on companies they do business with, and in this instance, to trample on local media organizations, whether you're talking about small-town newspapers, whether you're talking about local broadcasters, anyone in the journalism space that is producing content. Big tech routinely, daily, hourly, appropriates their content, rebroadcasts it, earns billions of dollars of revenue through advertisements in the process of broadcasting it, and gives not one penny of compensation for the creators of that content. I agree with Senator Klobuchar that that is an unfair system, and it is an abusive system. As I expressed at the initial markup we had on this bill, my principal concern is that big tech's abuse of power is not limited to the exercise of market power. They also abuse their power mightily in the public square. More and more, they are nakedly and brazenly engaging in censorship, silencing views they don't like. Right now, it so happens the views that they're silencing are right of center, but there's no guarantee that will continue. And indeed, for my Democratic colleagues, I would point out, whether you agree or disagree with the speech they're silencing, the idea that we would cede monopoly control of public discussion in America to 3 or 4 billionaires in Silicon Valley, modern-day American oligarchs, is profoundly dangerous. And you might agree with them today, but if they have the arbitrary power to decide tomorrow, they disagree with you, and so your views, what you have to say, will be silenced. That is, I think, incredibly dangerous. My concern with this bill as initially drafted is the antitrust immunity directed at allowing smaller media outlets to negotiate reasonable compensation packages could be used as a shield to negotiate agreements to further censorship. I think that would be a terrible outcome, and as I said at the initial markup, if we were able to adopt my amendment to prevent censorship, to protect free speech, then I would support the bill. And if we could not adopt that amendment, then I would oppose the bill. Initially, as everyone here is aware, when we took up the amendment, a majority of this committee voted to adopt my amendment. At that point, the authors of the bill pulled down the bill from further consideration. In the 2 weeks that followed, I've had extensive conversations. I've had extensive conversations with Senator Kennedy, and I've had extensive conversations with Senator Klobuchar, and sat down and heard her concerns, and we worked together on this amendment. I think this is a good amendment. I think this is a significant amendment. I think this amendment protects against this antitrust liability being used as a shield for censorship. Big tech hates this bill. That, to me, is a strong positive for supporting it. Moreover, if this amendment is adopted, this will be the first meaningful consequence for and protection against censorship based on viewpoint and content in the big tech space. That's a big deal, and so I join Senator Klobuchar in urging support for this amendment.
At this point, two senators have sought recognition, Senator Padilla and then Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me begin by reminding the committee that, as I said a couple of weeks ago, I support the stated objective of this bill. Quality, local, and regional journalism is a vital public good, and I'm eager to support the news community during these difficult financial times. But I continue to have concerns about the bill. I want to reiterate them for today's consideration. To begin with, I believe we need stronger language to ensure that the revenue from this bill goes to the workers that make journalism possible and is invested in the highly quality local journalism that those workers produce. While I appreciate that the sponsors have accepted changes that I requested to enhance the reporting obligations of news publishers, they're still just reporting requirements after the fact, with no built-in consequences or accountability. And I don't think public shaming will ensure unscrupulous owners support their workers. No amount of public shaming has succeeded with firms like Alden Global Capital, which, as Chairman Durbin knows well, took over and gutted the newsroom of the renowned Chicago Tribune, or Gannett, which spent more than $100 million on stock buybacks and executive pay, and then turned right around and laid off scores of journalists just last month. So as this bill goes to the floor, I implore my colleagues, including those who may not be members of this committee, to take a real close look at the bill and determine for themselves if this bill sufficiently protects workers in this critical industry. Now, second, I respectfully disagree with the statements that have been made suggesting that this bill is not about content moderation. I don't find myself saying this very often, but Senator Cruz was right to be concerned about this bill's impact on how information is both shared and consumed online. But we depart significantly on how the problems from this bill manifest. And while it's great that this committee spent the last 2 weeks ensuring that Senator Cruz is comfortable with the bill, my strong concerns remain unaddressed. The bill's prohibitions on the ability of platforms to take viewpoints into consideration and its overbroad retaliation provision, coupled with the compelled arbitration and the ambiguous definition of access, invite a world where covered platforms will have to pay for content and subsidize outlets they fundamentally disagree with. If you recall, 2 weeks ago, I raised the areas of disinformation, the dangers of disinformation, with election disinformation being just one example. Now, these provisions also work in concert to allow bad faith actors to force platforms to amplify the spread of hate speech and disinformation online. Now, finally, I worry greatly about the bill's impact on the open internet and the public's ability to access and share information. What is contemplated is compelling payment for truly foundational features of the internet. And the bill is plagued by vague terms. For example, the bill defines access of content as, quote, acquiring, crawling, and indexing content, but it does not define those key terms. Does acquire refer to an intentional action taken by a platform, or would it include every instance of a video or a piece of content that is uploaded by a user onto a platform? In other words, is a platform like YouTube, for example, acquiring content when a user uploads a video to its service? If the answer is yes, then this bill creates an opportunity for outlets like Project Veritas or InfoWars to simply upload their videos to YouTube and then compel payment from the company, from the platform. Confusion over the interpretation of these highly technical terms can be extremely consequential. And in general, this bill raises a number of policy and technical questions that demand more care and more consideration by this body. Mr. Chair, I again filed several amendments that seek to address the concerns I've highlighted. It's probably unsurprising that I think this bill still needs a lot of work. So as currently drafted, I would not be able to support the bill on the floor, but I'm well aware of the dynamics around these issues on this committee. So I look forward to ensuring that every senator has had an opportunity to closely examine this bill and grapple with the issues that it raises as the process continues, and to Senator Kennedy, Senator Klobuchar, others that have been so extensively involved in the negotiations thus far. I stand ready to continue to engage to have my concerns addressed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. We have requests for recognition of Senator Lee, Senator Hirono, Senator Ossoff. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'm pleased and want to congratulate Senator Cruz for working hard to make sure that the bill contains robust protections for free speech. He's gone out of his way to try to make sure that big tech platforms can't collude with news media entities when it comes to content moderation and censorship. However, I confess that I am a little bit confused by the sponsors' support for the amendment, as it seems to potentially undermine the stated purpose of the legislation itself. The new language prohibits and denies antitrust immunity to platforms and publishers from discussing or agreeing on how a platform, quote, displays, ranks, distributes, suppresses, promotes, throttles, labels, filters, or curates the content of the eligible digital journalism providers, close quote. So the parties are now restricted from discussing, from agreeing on, from otherwise colluding with regard to, quote, pricing, terms, and conditions under which the covered platform may access the content of the eligible digital journalism providers. So under the terms of the bill now, with the text of this amendment in place, the only thing it seems to do is to force the platforms to pay the fair market value, specifically for the right to acquire, crawl, or index the publisher's content. Now let that sink in for a minute. Currently, they can do that for free under the fair use doctrine of our intellectual property laws. They can already do that, and they can do that for free. So why do they need to collude to do that? The bill explicitly says that it doesn't change our copyright or intellectual property laws. So what exactly are they paying the publishers for? The platforms are paying publishers for a property right, but it's a property right that they don't own under our intellectual property rights, under our intellectual property laws as they now exist. And because this new language prohibits the platforms and the publishers from agreeing on how or whether or in what way or to what extent the platform suppresses conduct, then there's nothing to stop the platform from simply accepting an agreement and then not crawling or indexing or using the publisher's content at all, and thus not paying anything to the publisher. So this seems to me to contradict, if not to completely undermine, the non-retaliation provision that prohibits the platforms from de-indexing a publisher in response to the formation of a cartel, the very type of cartel that is specifically, and in my view, troublingly authorized by this bill. So all of this, while I applaud the efforts of the amendment, and I applaud anything that restricts censorship by big tech, and I'm therefore inclined to support the amendment, I don't think the amendment does what the sponsors think it does, and I think it might well undermine the whole thing. But all of this comes on top of my broader, grave concerns that are as strong today as they were a few weeks ago when we first marked this bill up. If anything, they have gotten stronger as I've read through this bill. Those concerns all still linger. Among other things, this is a bill that troubles me because it links the financial incentives of big tech platforms and the new industry by requiring tech platforms to share their monopoly rents with the news industry, with news publishers, making publishers more dependent on big tech, not less. So for those among us who are concerned about that, about the dependency of news publishers on big tech, you should be concerned about this. We also should worry anytime we're offering a special carve-out to antitrust laws, conferring a significant benefit on the news industry. This creates some opportunities for mischief in the legislative process. The bill retains the fundamental flaw of attempting to improve competition by sanctioning the formation of cartels, something that our antitrust laws go out of their way to prohibit, something that our antitrust laws prohibit with criminal penalties attached to them. And here we are rushing in to create them, to authorize them, to sanction them, to condone them. This is really troubling. Where does it stop? If we do it for this industry, why wouldn't we do it for others? Before long, you can imagine Congress engaging in other uncomfortably close relationships with other industries, concluding that those industries, too, are sufficiently important, sufficiently favored by specific politicians, that we have to create carve-outs to our laws imposing criminal and massive civil sanctions for cartel behavior. What happens then? Moreover, this bill, separate and apart from those other concerns, ends up favoring large conglomerate publishers over smaller, local publishers. It allows the big guys to take revenue away from the little guys. Remember, when these relief orders in one of these arbitration matters comes to a close, 65% of the sums awarded are allocated according to the number of personnel employed by the respective publishers. Now, yeah, they carve out those with more than 1,500 employees, but they don't take into account the fact that there are smaller conglomerates that have some sort of common ownership. The Gannett example that we talked about a few weeks ago. This is still a bad bill. This is still a bill that undermines competition. This is still a bill that actually exacerbates the dependence of news publishers on big tech. It certainly doesn't solve it, and I think it makes it a lot worse. But at least the Cruz amendment appears to impose some limitation, some restrictions on the news media and big tech colluding when it comes to censorship or content moderation, making the bill less offensive to me, but also, I think, making the bill even less effective in accomplishing what the bill incorrectly claims to do. And so I urge all of you to oppose this well-intentioned but highly problematic and ill-considered legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. We have two other senators seeking recognition, and I might say for the members of the committee, Senator Grassley has a conflict with an agriculture meeting at 10 o'clock, so we're trying to accommodate his schedule as well. So I recognize Senator Hirono, then Senator Ossoff.
We should tread carefully when we create exceptions to our antitrust laws, and I believe that Senator Klobuchar has done so, and I thank her and all of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle for working with us on this very important bill. And just very briefly, now more than ever, the United States free press is working overtime to protect our democracy. Local newspapers are a critical part of that work. They educate, inform, and incentivize readers in our communities to take part in our political system. Yet we are quickly losing these valuable sources of information. Between 2004 and 2019, Hawaii lost 38% of our local newspapers. This bill will help to stop this trend, ensuring our tradition of a diverse and free press. And that is why I will be voting for this bill, for this amendment. I thank, once again, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Kennedy and others for bringing forth this measure.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the bill's sponsors for putting forward this proposal. For nearly a decade, I led the production of public interest and investigative reporting focused on war crimes, organized crime, and official corruption. And public interest journalism is in crisis in the United States and around the world, and it serves a vital purpose in our democracy and in all societies. I do have some concerns about this legislation and how its implementation could impact journalism, could impact publishing. Whether or not in the detailed construction of this bill there may be some unintended consequences in terms of the impact on market consolidation within the publishing sector. What the long-term ramifications are for First Amendment applications online, for fair use, for access to information that's posted publicly. And I'll just state my overriding view that these platforms, which have consolidated massive amounts of power and market power and power over speech, as Senator Cruz noted, and which, as these behemoths do require balancing public policy to restore bargaining power to their counterparties in these negotiations, that they've done so through gross intrusions into Americans' privacy, exploitation without informed consent of Americans' data. And those underlying dynamics, the surveillance of the American people by these tech platforms and their dominance in the ad market, which is connected to their insight into the most intimate details of our private lives, will not be resolved by this legislation. That's not its purpose, and its purpose is a noble one, and again, I commend the sponsors of this bill for putting it forward, and the noble intention to give publishers and journalists the bargaining power necessary to realize the revenues they need to sustain themselves. I have these concerns about the legislation. We'll see how the markup proceeds, and I would like to play a constructive role in moving something through the process that is positive for publishers of public interest journalism. And I think it's possible that some of my concerns can be resolved after markup, working with the sponsors, should the bill proceed to floor action, to earn my support on the floor. But I want to register those concerns today, Mr. Chairman, at this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. If there is no one else seeking recognition at this point, we can consider the pending amendment, Amendment SIL 22B36. On the amendment, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Senator Hawley will be recorded as no.